friends, if you're new here, welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this adorable, sort of modernized, turn-of-the-century riding corset. This one right here. I modeled this corset off of the sort of like lingerie style turn-of-the-century corsets. I've seen some extant examples of corsets that are short like this, come to a point both in the front and the back. I think these corsets are adorable, and I really wanted to make a modernized version of one that had that period shaping but was a little bit simplified and also put enough structure in it so that I could actually use it as a structural undergarment if I want to. I have created a pattern which you can purchase. I will put the size range right here. But yeah, so this is a corset that I modeled off of these short riding corsets, but I turned it from a 7-piece corset to a 6-piece corset. Most of the extant examples that I've seen are 7-piece corsets. I think some are more, but I've seen quite a few 7-piece corsets, so it comes out to 14 pieces, 7 on either side. But I wanted to simplify it slightly, so I brought it down to 6 pieces. I'm calling this the Amelia corset. One of my lovely followers suggested that name, and I just thought it fit, so the Amelia corset. But yeah, let's get into it. So this is a pretty beginner-friendly corset. You don't have to worry about fitting the bust or the hips or the vertical space too much because it is just a waspie or a short under-bust corset. You can use any of your basic corset construction methods to make this corset. The one that I'm going to show in this video is a bag lining. I'll create a list of resources in the description of this video if you want to look into other methods of corset construction. But yeah, so getting into it. To make this corset, first you need to print out the pattern and cut it out. For some sizes you'll need to tape pieces together, so to do that you can just cut off the edge to the gray line, overlap it onto the next piece and tape it down. Make sure the scale is correct, and then to cut out this pattern I recommend cutting off the line, so cutting just on the inside edge of that line. That way when you mark the pattern pieces on your fabric, you're marking where the line was versus marking outside of the line, unlike I'm doing in this clip. Then make a mock-up, as you would with any other corset pattern. Not that I haven't made corsets without making a mock-up in the past, but I do recommend that you make a mock-up, as you should with any corset pattern. Once you have fit your mock-up and done any adjustments that you like, I will say that this corset is fairly hourglass shaped, so if you are more of a pear-shaped human, you have a smaller rib cage, and you can forget about like the bust and lower hip because this is just a waspie, so you're really just fitting the rib cage and the high hip. But if you have a fairly narrow rib cage, you may want to make the top a little bit smaller. So I would just like shave off maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch of the top part of the corset. So here's a really quick example of what I mean by that. My lines are pretty sloppy, but you can get the idea, just bringing the edge in a tiny bit and then blending it back out to the waist. If you already know that that's how your body is shaped, you could probably go ahead and do that before you make a mock-up, but that is up to you. This corset closes with a busk at the center front. For the pattern as is, it is an 8-inch busk. To construct this corset, the way that I'm doing it with the bag lining method, you cut out 2 of each pattern piece from the outer fabric and 2 from a lining fabric. So for the outer fabric, I'm using this beautiful blue silk, or kind of teal silk brocade that my grandmother got in China. I don't know when, but a while ago. And then for the inside, I'm using just a plain weave cotton poly blend. I do recommend being careful about remembering which pattern pieces are which because some of them are pretty similar, so either lay them all out how they're supposed to be so that you can just pick them up from there to sew them together, or label them. I like to actually write the number of the pattern piece on the pattern piece. Depending on what fabric you're working with, you may want to do this with a different style of marking device, or not at all. Keep track of which pattern piece is which. So then to sew them together, I just sew one to the other. I like to pin through the lines, the top and bottom, and then go through and pin along the line, checking on both sides to make sure that I'm really going through that exact seam line so I can sew this corset precisely. I point my pins towards the end that I'm going to start sewing at so that I can pull them out as I sew versus having to like pull them towards the presser foot. I went ahead and sewed all of my pattern pieces together on the right and left side of the corset with the outer fabric and the lining fabric.
This is a great time to press all of your seams, which I did do, but these fabrics don't really acknowledge the existence of an iron, so it's kind of hard to tell.
Then I basted the waist tape into the lining along the waist, having it come down a little bit more in the front. Then it's time to put in the busk. So I matched up the lines on the outer fabric and the lining along the center front, and then take the loop side of the busk and lay it on top where I want it and mark where all of those little metal loops are, and then sew along that line, stopping and back stitching, and then skipping the slot where the loop is gonna go, and then continuing and stopping and continuing. And then for the other side, you can just sew straight down it. Open it all up and press the seam allowance open and stick your busk loops right in there and fold it back in half. Then I took the loop side and put it on top of the other side to mark those holes where the stud side of the busk needs to come through. Then I used an awl to poke holes and push the little studs through, and then fold the rest of the corset back around it. At this point, you could sew around the edge of your busk with a zipper foot, but I don't have a zipper foot right now because I'm away from my stash of sewing things, so I basted the entire thing together, lining up all of those seams to make sure that everything is in line, and I sewed the busk in by hand with a spaced backstitch. For the center back, I folded the edges under to the line that I had marked, and then basted it closed and sewed along that edge, and then sewed one boning channel from there, and then a space for the grommets, and then another boning channel. I also created all of my boning channels, so I did one boning channel on each seam, so I just sewed about 3 millimeters away from the seam on either side. The waist tape was basted in before, but with sewing all of these boning channels, it's reinforcing that connection and sewing the waist tape in, so the waist tape is sewn in with all of the seams that create my boning channels. Then I got my plastic boning and trimmed it down to size for all of the boning channels, making sure that I had enough space on either side to add the binding. I clipped the edges of the boning down to be a curve and filed it down with a metal file so that it won't poke through the fabric. Then I went in and sewed along the edges of the corset for like a whole 1/4 of an inch, because the fabric that I'm working with, as you may have noticed, is so incredibly prone to fraying that I really wanted to just reinforce that edge so it wouldn't fall apart on me. So this is really not something that's necessary if we're working with like a nice couture, but because this satin brocade is clearly about to fall apart, I really wanted to reinforce that edge. For binding, I didn't have many options because, again, I'm away from my stash, so I ended up going with this satin ribbon, which I sewed on to the right side of the corset and then flipped around and sewed down by hand on the back. To set in the grommets, I put them about an inch apart, and then at the waist I put them slightly closer together. Then I just laced this corset up with the bunny ears lacing method, and it is done! love it. I think it's adorable, and I will definitely be using it both as a fashion outer corset and as a structural undergarment for historical ensembles. Again, you can find the pattern in the description box below, and also I'll put it in the end card somewhere. I will put some resources for other methods of corset construction in the description box below as well. You could absolutely do this as a single layer corset, as a welted corset, really, like I said, any corset construction method. Thank you so much for watching. Have fun if you make this corset. I'd love to see it. Tag me on Instagram. Bye!